Good morning. Hopefully, everything is going smoothly with the substitute. Today, we are going to do our first reading about weathering and erosion. This is kind of build on the lab we did yesterday. Um, you can read this on your own, or you can listen to me read it to you. If you listen to me read it to you, I'll have probably some hints on some of your questions, and I'll explain some things a little bit more thoroughly. So, the choice is yours. Just make sure if you're reading with me, you follow along. So let's get started on the first page here on weathering and erosion. So weathering and weathering and erosion. Weathering is the process of breaking down rocks. Wind and water work at the surface of a rock to wear away fragments and dust, chiseling and polishing the surface. There are two forms of weathering: chemical weathering and mechanical weathering. This picture here shows some rocks that have been weathered. If you can see, they have really smooth edges. And if you find a rock in a river, if it's been there for a while, it's pretty common to see these really smooth edges, and that's because of weathering. The first type of weathering we're going to talk about is chemical weathering. Chemical weathering involves a chemical change in at least one of the minerals within a rock, because all rocks are made up of different minerals. Rocks are not just crumbled into smaller rocks, they are actually being chemically altered. That is to say, after chemical weathering, we end up with a different substance than the one we started with. There are several types of chemical weathering that can occur. The first is hydrolysis. When water interacts with a mineral and changes it, the process is known as hydrolysis. One example of this is with the mineral feldspar that's found in granite rocks. When water encounters the feldspar, it changes into clay. So that's a new substance, so chemical weathering. The next one is oxidation. Another type of chemical weathering is oxidation. When a substance reacts with oxygen, you have oxidation. Rust is the result of oxidation. Rocks that contain iron can rust. When iron reacts with oxygen, it forms iron oxide, which is not a very strong substance. From there, the rocks may crumble and break down further. So this here is a picture of a rock that has gone through oxidation. So it's kind of crumbling and breaking down a little bit. Okay, on to page 2, weathering and erosion. Here, another form of chemical weathering is carbonization. Carbonization is the mixing of water with carbon dioxide to make carbonic acid. This type of weathering is how caves are formed. When carbon dioxide dissolves in rainwater or in moist air, it forms carbonic acid, and this acid reacts with minerals that are in the rocks. For example, the mineral calcite, which is in limestone, can be dissolved in carbonic acid. This can hollow out the rock and form a cave. So here we've got a picture of a cave that's been formed through the process of carbonization. Really cool. Right here on some rocks. Some rocks contain a lot of salt. These rocks are susceptible to another form of chemical weathering, hydration. So we know that from our last unit that hydra or hydro means water. So these rocks absorb water into their structure and swell as a result. So we've seen that water can expand things, like if you get a piece of wood wet, it will expand. If we get a sponge wet, it expands. This also happens to rocks. If water gets into the structure of rocks, it makes those expand. So hydration is mechanical weathering because the absorption of water and then the evaporation of that water causes the rock to swell and then contract. So it gets bigger and then smaller. And when it does that, it kind of creates cracks in the structure. So that's mechanical, but there's also a chemical part as well. And it explains it here. However, hydration is also a form of chemical weathering because new substances are formed. For example, anhydrite absorbs water and becomes gypsum. So anhydrite is a type of rock. It absorbs water and it becomes gypsum, a different type of rock. And then up here, right here, organic weathering. So that's another type of chemical weathering. Organic weathering is caused by interactions between plants and rocks. Now, whenever you see the word organic, that means, I know we're used to hearing the word organic when we're talking about food. If we call a food organic, all that means is that it's in food, it means something a little bit different than in science. In science, if you hear the word organic, that just means living matter. So if something's organic, that means it's either a plant or an animal. It's alive, it's living. So organic weathering is caused by interactions between plants and rocks. And it's organic because of the plants part. Lichen, which is kind of like a small little tiny plant, lichen extracts iron from rocks through a process called reduction. Decomposing plants, decomposing means breaking down and like dying after a plant's dead, it decomposes, it breaks down. Decomposing plants release humic acid, which attacks calcium, magnesium, and iron minerals, causing chemical changes in the rock. So here we've got an example of lichen forming on a rock. This green stuff kind of looks a little bit like moss, but moss is usually soft. Lichen is like a hard substance, so it feels kind of just like a rock, but it's that bright green color. So that's lichen. That's uh, organic weathering, which is a type of chemical weathering. Okay, last page. Mechanical. So we talked all about chemical. Now we're talking about mechanical. Mechanical weathering involves physically breaking the rock into fragments without changing the chemical composition. So if I were to take a piece of paper and rip it in half, I would still have paper. I haven't changed the substance at all. So that's what mechanical weathering is. It's not just about paper though. So if we take a rock and use a hammer, break the rock in half, we've still got two rocks. We haven't changed what kind of rock they are. They're just smaller pieces. So that's what mechanical is. Mechanical weathering slowly chisels and buffs rocks and other surfaces. An example of mechanical weathering is the formation of Antelope Canyon in Arizona. That's shown right here. Rushing water carved out the sandstone, leaving wavy looking rock formations. This one is in Arizona, but we have a lot of examples of this in southern Utah. If you've ever been to Zion National Park or like Arches National Park and seen that big delicate arch that's like on the license plates, that's that was formed this same way with like wind and rushing water and things. Erosion, specifically, is when the rock particles are moved by wind or water. These pieces may be transported. So we've got like little teeny pieces and they're moving through the water or the wind. These pieces may be transported a short distance, like just a few inches, or a long distance, like several miles. The rock pieces will mix with other matter like sand and plant debris to become sediment. So they move and then they kind of fall to the ground and they mix together. And then the rock pieces will mix with other matter like sand and plant debris to become sediment. This is an important part of the rock cycle. These sediments will layer and become compressed, so pressed together, compacted, and cemented over time, creating sedimentary rock. So you've got little particles that have chipped off rock, and they kind of go through the air, they fall down, they mix with other things, and then they get pressed and pressed and pressed and become a big piece of rock again. So that's kind of describing what the rock cycle is. Just like with the water cycle, how water is never created or destroyed, it just changes forms as it evaporates, condenses, precipitate, collect. The same thing happens with rocks, except that rocks don't evaporate. They do change. They don't, I don't know, they kind of do change state. They don't turn to vapor necessarily like water does, but like little pieces chip off and turn to small pieces, and then they compact and turn into big pieces, and then they might go into the crust and melt into lava, and then they spew out as a volcano, and like it's kind of like the same kind of rock cycle, that little pieces of rock turn into join together and make big pieces of rock, and then they break apart. So that's the rock cycle. Rock is never created or destroyed. It just kind of erodes and then compacts and then erodes and then compacts. Okay, last paragraph. Sorry, I kind of got on a tangent a little bit there. Sometimes weathering and erosion happen simultaneously, so that means they're happening at the same time. For example, glaciers are enormous bodies of ice that scrape against the sides of rock and mountains, carving out huge canyons. As they move along, they pick up huge pieces of rock. They carry the rocks along. When the ice recedes, that means like melts, rocks can be left scattered in the valley that has been formed. One of the most striking example of glaciated, that means made with a glacier, a glaciated valley can be seen in Yosemite National Park, and that's pictured right here. This is a picture. This huge canyon was created by a glacier that was going along and scraping, and it shaved away at the sides. Glaciers literally shaved away the mountainsides, creating deep valleys with tall vertical walls. Okay, now it's time for questions. You'll do that in this section down here where you would typically submit an assignment. Let me get to the first question. What can you infer about this statement? So remember, infer means use your background knowledge, things you already know, plus things you learned from the reading to fill in the gaps or to make a guess. Some rocks contain a lot of salt. These rocks are susceptible to another form of chemical weathering, hydration. So what blanks can you fill in about that sentence? Okay, question 2. On page 2, that's the one that has the cave and the lichen. It looks like maybe. This one is page 2. So look at that page to answer this second question. On page 2, what is one example the author gives to support the idea that organic weathering involves plants? So look on that page, find organic weathering. How do we know that organic weathering involves plants? How does the author let us know that? And then question 3, excuse me. Explain how weathering and erosion contribute to the rock cycle. So when I was talking about the rock cycle, the little particles and they all fall and they mix together and they compress and then they make a big rock, and then that rock, you know, it's eroded and it happens over and over again. Explain that in your own words. How does weathering and erosion contribute to that rock cycle or make that rock cycle happen? All right, so that's your assignment for today. Good luck, and I will see you tomorrow.